Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 5, part 2 of the Ready, Steady, Go webinar series. Today we have Dave Simpson back, and Dave is joining us to speak about the development versus winning and how to strike the balance between the two in youth and adult players. Regardless of if you're a club coach, development squad, or inter-county coach, there'll be some very, very good hints and tips in here for you. So we touch on the dangers of early specialisation and trying to talent ID at too young an age and the pitfalls of doing that, how to create the best environments to allow players to develop themselves all the way from youth up to adult. And then we look at how to keep them engaged if they don't quite make it at this, from the start. How do we make sure they stay involved in the sport and they stay engaged with the pathway? And Dave then also touches very briefly on coach mentoring and why it's a good idea to have a coach mentoring system and the benefits that can bring. So again, I hope you get something out of it. And over to Dave again. In terms of the kind of crux of the presentation, which would be the kind of development versus winning, it's the age-old question that no one seemed to crack yet. Sports try different things all the time. Ours being a female-only sport, you know, we have the same issues as other female sports in terms of dropout. It's a massive issue, especially in teenage. And then in Camogie, where we have the development squads that start at 14s up the way. So there's always this debate between what's the right level of introducing competition, how do you do it, and then you have the club versus the development squad kind of atmosphere in it. So in terms of your own experiences of similar structures, because certainly coming over to Scotland would have been a similar structure, just slightly older level, but the structure was still similar. What would you say would be the best way to develop players along that pathway, so kind of from the youth to the adult spectrum, regardless of what game you're in?
I think I should probably start by saying that you know, I'm the head coach of a national team, which typically wouldn't be very involved in development structures and things like that. I mean, they would have a lot of interest in that, but the nature of our sport, and I think the nature of your sport too, is everybody mucks in, and you know, there isn't a lot of money, there isn't a lot of infrastructure around these things, and so. And it actually has been part of my job both in Scotland and New Zealand because I required it to be, because I have a passion for development. You know, the first real question you have to ask yourself is, you know, are we talking about participation? You know, are we talking about performance? We're of course talking about both, but every question has to be kind of in that sort of framework. You know, maybe this helps participation but doesn't enhance performance, or vice versa. They're not mutually exclusive, but it's a bit of a dynamic force between them. I would say, and I claim no real expertise at this. I can only tell you what I've observed and what I had sort of thought as we're starting to develop things in New Zealand and otherwise. And the first thing probably is, you know, the challenge of trying to grow the participation, getting more kids interested in our sport. And you and I know that sports participation among young girls is a real problem in the UK and in the US and otherwise. You see them dropping out at early ages. We want, you know, with all the positive benefits of sport participation, we want as many girls involved as possible. So there's that sort of element. But to do that, if you get more kids interested, then you've got to have coaches for them that know what they're doing and are trained to do a good job at that. Then you need fixtures, and that requires a certain kind of infrastructure, doesn't it? You know, people running leagues and things like that. And then for that, you need more umpires. And all these things kind of have to grow at the same time. We're not an Olympic sport, neither is Camogie. And so we don't have a ton of money to make these things happen. So it depends on a really active volunteer corps to make it happen. You know, to grow all these things in unison. You can't get all the players interested, get a bunch of coaches, and now you go to have fixtures and you don't have umpires. You know, it all has to go kind of at the same time, which requires infrastructure and coordination and things like that. And I know what your organization is very involved in doing, and that's the point of these questions, isn't it? Is how best to set those things up. And I have no firm answers about that, but I do have some ideas. And one of the ideas is, maybe the first idea in a way, is the criticality of the first coaches that a player has. So, you know, who's your first coach? It's typically your mom or dad on the team, at least is in the sport that I'm in. And, you know, they've seen the game. Maybe they played when they were young. They know a bit about it. And they're willing to do it. That's kind of the main thing. They're willing to do it. And, how do we best prepare them for that? We might think it's like, well, we just have to teach them how to teach the techniques and a little bit of tactics, and then that's kind of it. But I think there's so much more in that criticality of that phase, because, if they get it wrong, then those players drop out potentially. They don't have a good time, so keeping it fun, one. Two, learning the techniques of almost the crowd control elements of working with 6, 7, 8-year-olds, keeping it fun, but also kind of, keeping it engaged. Very, very challenging. Any preschool, kindergarten teacher will tell you.
All children running all over the place. Yeah.
Exactly. Chickens again. But then teaching them some of this science about how to construct a practice. And I can talk a little bit about that later if you like, how to put a practice together so that it leads them by the nose, thing to thing, how to set up a drill so that players aren't standing around, because that's where most of the misbehavior comes from. Those are techniques that, if the first coaches don't know it, then the practices don't go well. In my sport, they could potentially be unsafe because the cross ball is very hard. You get those things whizzing around, and you set up the drill incorrectly, it could be unsafe. So those first coaches really need to be coached up so they don't chase players away and keep them safe. So I know we're going to talk about sort of coaching development, but that is one of the key elements, is making sure. Well, I'm going to say something that's slightly the opposite of that, is that we also need to make it pretty frictionless. In other words, I've seen programs where, it's like you've got to go to this weekend course and take this exam before you can ever go on the pitch with a player. And I'm kind of more like, hey, you're interested? Come out and shadow me, and I'll actually give you a drill and then have you fall in love with it. And then you're going to go get your certification, and then off you go. So I want to make it as frictionless as possible on the one end, but then making sure that educational element isn't overburdening, but also covers all the important elements of technique, tactics, and just how to manage things from a physical and a psychological, frankly, point of view with the players. So I think that's maybe the first thing I'd talk about, is that criticality of that early step.
Yeah. So coaches, yeah, and I think in terms of the coach mentoring, certainly that's something we'll touch on later in terms of the actual support for them afterwards. Saying that definitely is, or we can talk about it now if it suits you better in terms of how you actually support those coaches.
Yeah, I think basically, I think the idea is that there has to be an education system so that they are, I'm still continuing to improve as a coach. There should be a pretty simple system in place for them to be able to do it. And a key element of that is the feedback / mentoring piece of that they're not just out there by themselves. Like, I've been given this group of 8-year-olds, never coached before. I played when I was a kid, but now I've got these kids, and they're just going hog wild, and they're bashing each other with the sticks, and I don't know the first thing about how to manage this. So there has to be a mentoring, that they have a mentor coach that they can call on, somebody that comes out to the trainings and gives them feedback, saying like, yeah, the reason they're hitting each other with sticks is your lines are too long. They're not engaged in the drill, and also you haven't made the drill competitive because they're not playing for anything, so they're not paying attention. So there are little tips and tricks that they could be taught along the way. So it's not just going to courses, doing online courses, getting certifications. It's really just, who do I call when, it's just going off the rails a bit. So I think that's probably, a system that involves that. I mentioned before that, in my sport, there just isn't a lot of money. I don't know the Camogie situation quite so much, but that's just a volunteer basis. That's just getting people to put their name on a list, saying willing to be a mentor, willing to be mentored, and then matching them up and letting them go at it. Mm-hmm. But then more structurally setting up an education system that, okay, I've done this. I've taken that beginner course. I got that certification, had a good year with my 8-year-olds. Hey, I love this. I want to keep going. Now, what's the next sort of piece of education? And then having kind of a database, and this may exist for you guys already, I don't know, but a database of techniques, tactics, drills, but also here are excellent books to read. And I don't mean just about Camogie, I mean about coaching practice. Here are podcasts to listen to. There's some tremendous podcasts out there just now, and articles to read and things like this. So maybe I know we could do more on coaching development later, but I think as to the beginning level, I think that's probably a good note. Yeah,
get into that, because I'm just thinking, like, in terms of resources, the GA they have some good stuff on their e-learning website where you can build a session plan, and it gives you ideas of drills and stuff like that, and that's all there. Right. I think the art of coaching is the part that people find harder. Like for us to, if anyone wants to work with a kid at any point over here, you have to do your foundation course first, along with your police check and a safeguarding course. So that has to be done before you do anything. So a lot of times it's the actual, it's a 1 day course, and then the support afterwards can sometimes be lacking just because of numbers, because it is all parents, and sometimes the parent will just follow their child up the age groups, but not actually be any more trained from when they were dealing with under 8s to under 16s. They can kind of go all that way without having any different training. So I think it's something that you'd always want to emphasize, is that someone's a coach to come in and help you and just give you some advice would be key.
Yeah, I think one of the piece of that too is just checking ourselves on the motivation of the stakeholders. So somebody comes in as a coach, first time coaching, I want to win some games. Let's go. And hey, nothing wrong with winning. It's number one on my list too. But they don't know the number 2 part, of like, we're going to do it in a way that's player centric, et cetera. But if that's their only thing, like, I'm going to come in and win games, you've got, again, I'm only somewhat familiar with the structure there, but I think it's the clubs then are very motivated by winning inter-club things or whatever. You guys are structured in that way, but at some point the organization has these motivations around performance, and so that drives their activities. Parents have motivation. Hey, my kid just crushed it at the Camogie game this weekend, and they can brag about it down at the pub.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And so you have all these these highly motivated stakeholders. No one's mentioning the players in that. What do the players want out of it? And so that, again, we're just talking about we're talking about all levels, but I want to say more about the upper levels perhaps, but at the beginning level, if you can keep it fun and get them back next year, you've done an awful lot. And you brought them along to some degree, at the very early ages. And then as they get older, then it starts to get, more performance oriented. But it's enough to get them back often if participation is your goal. Now, from a performance point of view, you got to make sure your high achievers are getting the best kind of education they can get too, that brings them along.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's getting that balance between giving all the players time to play, in terms of making sure, regardless of ability, they get a chance to play and train, but then making sure if they are advancing at a higher level, then they have to be stimulated as well. So stimulating them at their level.
Yeah,
that's going to be a tough one, I suppose. Even on, I can lead on nice to the next part. So specifically talking about in terms of, because we have our development squads here from under 14s up the way, under 14 all the way to adult, and the kind of the getting that balance between development, because they are development squads technically, but they have a performance basis as well in terms of just by their very nature. So in terms of the things you'd be looking for in that, and I kind of liken it to what you were doing with Scotland, because when you came in with Scotland, you brought in a B team as well as the A team, also almost like a development squad underneath that. So just kind of your motivations behind that, and then the kind of best way you would see, or the considerations when you're putting something like that in place.
Yes, Stuart, I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So these development teams are the performance teams, and then there are club teams sort of that are more developmental, say, underneath that. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
okay. Yeah. Just want to make sure I understood. Yeah. Because then, I think down at that level, if I can just kind of go down and I'll work my way up to the performance level, what's the point? Again, it's more participation at that level. If we're talking about that spectrum, this is more the participation level. And the key there is just getting kids the maximum amount of touches on the ball. That's the whole game. And setting up practices and drills in a way that every player, whether it's your top player or your bottom player, is getting maximum touches on the ball. If you set up a drill in a way that the player that's just learning the game and really struggling, if they can hide in the drill and they're not getting the touches, they're not developing. And they potentially, if 6, 7, 8 years old, they could be a world beater. You just don't know who this kid's going to be. But if they're not getting the touches, that's not it. So keeping it fun, making sure they get the touches. Now, if we can, I'll kind of meet you where you asked the question then on these more development teams that lead to performance. It ends up being kind of the same thing because at those younger ages, you start to get into some of these biases around the maturational differences, and we can talk about biobanding, the biobanding concept a little bit if you like. There's also the is it the relative age bias, which is basically if there's a selection date, say your selection date is January 1, and you've got a kid with a birthday January 2, they are developmentally a year beyond the December 31st birthday. And so they've done studies and found that this is a tremendous predictor of success at the elite level. You do a chart and you'll find the birthdays of the best players are right after the selection date. So it carries forward, even though it happened when they were 6, 7, 8 years old, it carried forward all the way to the elite level. And so that relative age bias is a big factor too. And so even with those development teams, you've got a kid who's perhaps undersized, hasn't quite grown into their body yet, not very strong, but they're picking up the skills, they're very coachable, they've got a great work rate. You know, you've got to see that kid more for their potential than for their current performance. And the whole point of this, if we're going to talk about ultimate performance being the thing, like we want to produce the best adult camogie players we can, you've made your pool then of potential players much larger. You've brought along a lot more players than if you took that kid that's perhaps undersized, a little slow, and said, hey, you can be on this development team, but you're not going to get that many touches in training. You're not going to get that much playing time. And now they're really being held back and they never quite catch up. So I think even with those teams, there has to be an element of making sure that we're developing all the players. And then of course there's a selection, and the selection is always of the best players on the day. So biobanding, relative age bias, none of that should factor into that selection, but things that feed into that, there should be considerations around that, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I think it would be a common complaint from some people that would be, for example, you know, there's 15 players on a camogie team, and you sometimes have 36 to 40 on a squad, and we've got a panel over here of players. So there's only 15 players that are playing, and then you've got 15 and maybe 20 players who are sometimes not seeing much game time at all. So you'd say it's vital that they're getting as much game time as possible and attention in training.
Yeah, and I think, you know, back to the performance participation model, you know, it's depending on the team that I have, I'm going to communicate where we're at with that. So, you know, if I take a team of 24 players on a tour of the U.S., we play some of the best teams in the world, and I've only got 10 players on the pitch at any time, I'm really saying to the whole team, you know, many of you will feel like you didn't get enough playing time. From my perspective, I want to bring along every player and give them opportunities, but I'm not going to do a real-time check of playing time. If you have an issue around playing time, let's put it on the table. Let's talk about it. But I make no promises around it, and you know, I want to bring along as many, you know, all the players sort of equally. It is a challenge, and communication is the only thing that fixes it. Like I said before, at any given time, you make a decision about who's starting, who's playing, and then you've got some portion of the population angry at you. So that's just a given. So you know, communication is just your only answer there. You know, if you just pin a list to the wall and walk away and say, here are the starters and here are the non-starters, without any kind of conversation, you know, ideally before that list goes up. I mean, that's what I try to do. I've done some selections where people have dedicated a year of their lives to prepare for a tournament, and then find out at the last minute they weren't selected. That's brutal stuff. That deserves a real conversation, and not just a list on the wall.
Yeah, but that's actually quite a good comparison between what would happen at the kind of adult or elite level, and then what should happen at the kind of younger age group. Because even down at the younger under 14 age group, there's still only 15 players that can play in one game, regardless. So it's still going to have that selection. But it's how you go about it, and the communication aspect, I think, is what you're trying to get across. Very good point.
Yeah. No, it's hard stuff. There's no easy way around it. But I think, again, communication, transparency, honesty, integrity is one of the main characteristics of a good coach. So keeping integrity around your process. If you say you're going to do it a particular way or based on a particular standard, I always come into these things with a rubric. So I've listed, you know, 6 or 8 things that I'm looking for from the players, so that if they say, Coach, why did I not get the start? I can just pull out the rubric and say, you know, in this particular area, I'm just not seeing kind of improvement I'm looking for. You know, you need to work harder on this. And it might be technical, it might be tactical, it might be speed, agility, it might be coachability, it might be commitment, attendance, you know, but I can just pull out a piece of paper and point point at it instead of some nebulous thing like, oh, well, I just wasn't seeing what I was looking for. It doesn't really work for a player, and they deserve more than that.
Okay, yeah. So having some sort of tangible evidence to back it up is better for both.
Yeah, at the beginning of the season, the more you can communicate expectations and put it on paper at the beginning of the season, it saves you later. It really does as a coach.
I suppose I've got a couple of kind of quick fire questions just on little bits you talked about there. So you touched on kind of judging kids too young before they mature, and then kind of confusing talent with physical maturity. Do you see that quite a lot? And and is there kind of certain pitfalls that you would see from having that approach? So that the child is bigger than everybody else.
Yeah, so I think I have to be really careful about how I talk about this, because the point is to win games, and the point is performance. So but the flip side, we want maximum participation, and we want to have integrity in the process. And so, at what point do we start to do the talent identification? At what age are we saying, hey, there's an 8-year-old that's got real potential. We want to make sure that they kind of get on the program. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you kind of do that in a holistic way, but also realizing, again, these biases around maturational differences and relative age differences, that you may be leaving players behind that you don't want to leave behind. So again, having a process that's well articulated and structured and flexible, because you need to look at it at the end of every year and saying, are we getting out of this what we want? Who did we leave behind this year? Who did we bring along that maybe wasn't quite ready? And take on your own feedback. I'm coaching a U15 academy in New Zealand at the minute, because we figure that's the age there, 13, 14. They're starting to get pretty serious about the sport. Even at that age, though, one of the things I feel strongly about is they don't do single sport, that they do multiple sports, that they play with us, but then they are also doing football or hockey or swimming or something else. I know you're an expert at this. You get the repetitive stress injuries. If they go into a single sport too early, they get burnout. And it actually makes them a better athlete. They can bring in elements of other sports that enhance their game in lacrosse or camogie. So I think making sure that that talent identification is a process that we articulate well in advance, and we make sure it's kind of a holistic process, and we don't leave players behind.
That's a very interesting point, because again, it's been noted a few times that some, especially when you get to a development squad age, which is kind of under 14 up, the way that all of a sudden it's just right. Camogie should be your only focus, and it can sometimes be younger than that as well. This should be your only focus. You shouldn't focus. People almost are scared to let them play other sports in case they lose them to the other sports, which can sometimes happen. But you're absolutely right in terms of the data saying that the best players eventually are the ones that play the most sports and are generally happier at a younger age.
No, it's true. And even the kid who's just like camogie mad and that's all I want to do, they don't understand what they're sort of giving up, that it is good to take a mental and physical break from the sport, because if you're doing the same motion over and over, you're really putting pressure on joints and things. So I think that multiple sport participation is really important. I'll use kind of an example of I think it's a negative example of the way we do it here in the States in most sports. I'll use lacrosse, but it's not just lacrosse. It's baseball and softball and everything else. And it's basically that we're motivated over here by college scholarships. That's not a problem so much there, but here you can pay for your college education through a sports scholarship if you're one of the top players. And so from a very early age, parents, stakeholders again, very motivated to have my kid to be a top player. And so there's a great culture for coaching over here, because you can make a lot of money being an elite level coach to 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. They throw the stick in the crib, and then as soon as possible get them onto what we call a travel team. So this it wouldn't be the equivalent of your clubs, because in the summer they travel in different tournaments all over the country, literally, with top coaches. And the whole idea being to be seen by a college coach who then recruits you and gives you a scholarship, and you save $250,000 on your education. So that's the motivation. So, the kid is led by the nose to play these sports year round, to do a lot of travel. It's a lot. Every game is super pressurized. You better play well today because so-and-so coach is watching you. And they burn out. And also, I worry about ACLs with women and young girls, as I know you do. And so they get those kinds of repetitive stress injuries. Then they get, even if they get the brass ring, was it what they wanted all along? Or was it the other stakeholders in their lives, their parents and their coaches that wanted it? Because sometimes they'll get there and go, wait a minute, now instead of being able to concentrate on my lacrosse, I now have 2-a-day trainings, and, the teams are choosing my courses for me, and stories you hear about Division I, especially players. So I know it's an extreme example, but it just demonstrates some of the pitfalls if you just get on a treadmill that's only performance oriented and is not holistic about like what's best for this kid. And they're not always the best ones to decide for themselves, are they? So yeah.
That's a very good point. And a kind of balanced on that would be just from something you mentioned earlier about the when you have players on that talent pathway. So how have you seen it work well where players have a chance of entering the talent pathway at a later stage? So they've not quite matured or not been spotted at a younger age. How do you have it and what are the benefits of having an almost like an open pathway where they can join up later?
Yeah, and you mentioned it before. We had the B team in Scotland, so we had the elite team that played in the tournaments representing Scotland. But we also had a B team that went to those tournaments and also performed. And then I brought that into the New Zealand setup now as well, because what it means is that you can have a player that has a lot of demonstrable skill. There may be the speed. And just grew into her body, but doesn't have the stick work yet because the pathway didn't benefit her. She missed out on the training she would have had along the way. I can then bring her onto that development squad, that B team. Same coaches coach both teams. And so we can teach the systems, we can teach the techniques and the tactics. They go off and do, I think you guys do wall ball as well, same kinds of things that lacrosse do. They can go off and work on the technical things. You and I worked with a tremendous athlete that was an average B team player, I think it's fair to say, but had tremendous speed, but just didn't have the skills otherwise. And then the opportunity to have played alongside the elite team, she just got stars in her eyes and said, that's what I want, and went out on her own and did the work, and then showed up the next year, trialed for that team, scored 4 goals in one of the matches at European Championships this last time. So, and then maybe another example of that is I had a young player who was probably right on the cusp of being good enough to make that senior team, but she wasn't going to get much playing time there. She wasn't going to develop. Just because that is the performance team. There is development's done. We're there. So I actually had her play for the B team instead of taking her to the tournament with the senior team, because she got maximum play time. She was the star of the game. Got lots of touches on the ball. Learned all the same tactics and techniques that the senior team was working. And I think that was her best preparation. So next round, she's going to be good to go. So, so I think having some kind of development team that meshes with your most elite teams, I think is a good practice.
Yeah, which again comes back to kind of communication and almost like a coaching system where you're all talking to each other and it's all kind of integrated.
That's it.
As opposed to being separate entities, yeah.
Yeah, and then up and down the program too, like our structure is the senior team, U19, U15s. So having those coaches be somewhat in alignment. This is one of the things you have to be careful about, because I think all coaches should have their own, be able to bring in their own style of play and have, rather than the senior coach saying, this is what we do in our program up and down the program. And I know a lot of sports do that. I just happen to personally be against it. But I think we should have the same terminology. I think we should have the same notion, the big picture stuff of our style of play, our character as New Zealand lacrosse. I think that should be the same up and down the program. And that those coaches should be really talking to each other in terms of player development and things like that. Because one of the things, it's true of my program, and it may not be true in Camogie, is if I have an elite athlete, I'm going to work with her for 10 years. I can't get her to an elite level and hold her there for 10 years. It's not a professional sport. She has a day job. She perhaps has a family. I've got not a lot, but I've got some players that have kids. And so they've got their lives outside. And so I can't get them at that level and keep them there. And it's true even of the under 19s and the U15s. You know, if you get them at elite level and try to hold them there for too long, they burn out. And so there has to be an ebb and flow, and those have to be negotiated somewhat among those coaches at different levels. I don't want players arriving burned out to my program, so I'm in communication with the U19 coach about their preparation and trying to get that right.
That's a very good point. Again, I think it's something that Camogie and the GA probably still haven't cracked yet, in terms of when it becomes county and club. County very much wins at the moment, and club kind of becomes second, as a distant second place in that conversation. So where there's situations where players don't see their clubs for most of the year.
Yeah, and it's tricky, Stuart. I'm not saying I have any answers. I can describe the problem really well, I think, and I've thought about it, and I just think it's kind of asking the right questions, and I think that the questions you brought, I think, are the right ones to be asking ourselves, you know, in both of our sports, you know, and you know, try to make sure we have best practices around these things, and then give ourselves feedback at the end of the season and say, you know, where did we get it right? Where did we get it wrong?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. All this goes back to communication. If communication is good between everybody, and it's for the right reasons, which you mentioned previously, I think that's the key to everything. If everything's done for the right reasons, which is the players' welfare and happiness, everything will be all right. Last kind of one I had on that was, you mentioned a couple of players that have kind of gone from not being on the top squad to kind of making it. In terms of something that happens with our development squads all the way up is a natural part of it. People kind of come on and off the development squad as it is. How would you, or what are the best methods you've seen of keeping in touch with players that go from being on the squad to just being off the squad, or the development squad we would have it here? How do you keep them engaged to make sure they bounce back and they don't kind of sulk or just completely give up the game because they're just fed up with it?
Yeah, I would say at the elite level, I've not always been successful at that. In other words, if somebody has dedicated years of their life to make a squad and then they didn't, you know, are they going to commit more of their time? If they're, you know, 28 years old and, you know, kind of at the sunset of their career a little bit anyway, you know, are they going to stay? I'm not sure I was always successful saying, hey, stay on board and play with the B team, because they kind of see it's sort of the end of their career. And so I wouldn't say I've always been successful, but where I have been, it really is an approach that says she is actually still my player. Like I sent her down or whatever you want to call it, but she's still my player. She's still in development for my team, and so I'm still keeping in touch. How's it going? You know, and also this is true of players that I think are coming up that we've done some talent identification. It's my job to help them get ready. I make no promises about the results, but I can help you get ready for giving your best shot at trialing for this. And, you know, not getting selected is sometimes for cause. You know, you're just not fast enough. You haven't done the work. Your stick skills aren't quite there. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's you've done everything right, and then you weren't selected because you know, positionally the coaches had to go a different direction for positional balance or something else. And so you have those conversations with the players when you deselect them or don't select them, send them down if you want to put it that way, and then keep it, you know, saying, look, I'm still part of your team. You know, I'm still you know, want to bring you along on this. I will create training opportunities with the senior squad. Like you haven't made this squad, but you can come out to be part of the training squad, you know, to come out and compete against us. I don't know if that works from a numbers point of view for Camogie, but we always feel the need to have extra players out to kind of help train our elite squad so we can do more full field kinds of things. And so keeping them engaged in that way. And again, I think it's, you know, the moment they're deselected or not selected for a squad is a traumatic thing. I mean, it can be very traumatic, tears, and, you know, some of the toughest conversations I've ever had were around these things. And, you know, I have players that won't talk to me to this day because they just think I was wrong. And you know, you have to kind of live with that. But the bottom line is, you know, if you keep the communication going, whether you've selected them or deselected them, and then they know that you've been honest in the process. And if they walk away, you know, fair enough. It's their decision.
Is there any, and just I suppose linking onto that, is there any advice you'd have for a club coach? So if somebody's been dropped from a county or a kind of elite performance that you're involved in, and they're going back to the club, any tips or suggestions for how a club coach can work with them?
Yeah, I think going back to this collaborative approach, they come back in, hey, let's have a conversation. First of all, you haven't been on this team, but this team is yours as much as anyone else's. So don't come in here thinking it's someone else's team and I'm just the new kid. No, come in and communicate that to all the players. Like, everybody's here equally. And then, you're going to perhaps see a drop in the level of your teammates. I mean, that's one of the big issues, right? Is you drop down and suddenly people are just playing balls and things that you didn't see at the higher level. It can be incredibly frustrating. And so bringing them a bit into the leadership aspect of that. Hey, let's make everybody better. By communicating with your teammates what you see, be a little bit of a coach on the pitch, learn to be a leader in this opportunity. And then my job as your club coach to help you get back up there. So what did coach tell you needed to work on? And you can have a side conversation with that coach as well and say, let's do those things. Let's get you there. And now they're going, oh, okay, I'm still on the pathway. I'm still got something to work for. I think that's probably the key thing in the end, but making them feel welcomed onto the new team and giving them a role that makes them feel a bit special, I suppose, is a good one, captaincy or something like that.
Yeah, that's good advice. And again, you would be quite open to coaches, club coaches, kind of phoning you saying, "Look, I've got so and so back here," and just asking for advice as why they were dropped and why they would, what they need to work on.
Love it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'll have it on on my rubric. I'll know exactly what they need to work on, and if it's, sometimes it can be things like coachability. It can be attitudinal. And so that needs to be said too. They need to go down and work on their maturity. They need to go down and work on their, their work rate, because they've been given assignments and they haven't done, and we just don't think their approach is ready yet. So whether it's technical, tactical, or approach, just having communication around that works.
That's a very good point. So Dave, we've taken up loads of your time in terms of doing this. In terms of questions, I only had one last one for you. I'm just touching on, we talked a little bit about the coach mentoring system last time. So really just a kind of wee bullet point, 1 or 2 minutes on the coach mentoring system. It's something you did with Scotland very well. So for example, one of your assistant coaches from last year has now progressed on to head coach. So in terms of the pathway, that's obviously worked very well. Is the coach mentoring system something that's quite important to you? And in terms of how you do it, what benefits have you found from having it? Is the first question probably, and then the second question is, how can that be implemented from way down in the youth setup all the way up to adults?
Yeah, so it was also a criteria for me to take the New Zealand job that I'd be involved in coaching development, because it's another passion of mine, and something I did in Scotland. And essentially, in Scotland, there was no infrastructure for it, so I just kind of made myself available. So if there was a university that either had an experienced coach or was player coached, I would just go out there and work with them, show them some drills. I've got a couple of, one sheets, I call them, that I can send out of, here's how to put together a practice. Here's the curriculum of what you need to accomplish in a season, just to give them a checklist to go through of like, oh, I forgot I need to teach offensive transition. And then making myself available as a mentor. Just call me up if I coach. My kids are just tired of these ground ball drills I've been doing. You have any more ground ball drills for me? That kind of thing. So it was very informal in Scotland. Now coming over to New Zealand, we're trying to set it up more formally. And with the lockdown, we've gotten away from it slightly. But we're going to be doing a coaching development, more formal program there, where each year we select 8 coaches into the program and have an actual curriculum for them that takes them along. It's not a certification so much as getting them deep into coaching. So they'll be shadowing, mentoring. I'll be giving them assignments to read books, watch film, listen to podcasts, get certifications as well, in parallel, and trying to do it in a more formal way. But the fact is, if any coach ever called me and said, hey, listen, I need some advice, or I need some feedback, or can you come along to a training and maybe pump up our kids a little bit, I'm glad to do it if I've got the time and the travel capability to. So it's just a personal passion of mine. In terms of setting up a system for that, now you're getting into more infrastructure kinds of ideas, and it sounds like you guys have done some work on that, certainly, and maybe a lot of work. I haven't seen it, but in terms of here's some drills, here's some ideas for running your practices and things like that. But then actually pairing up your more experienced coaches with your less experienced coaches, getting a mentorship program around that, I think would be good.
Yeah, just on that, and I think that might put a lot of people off, especially at the younger level. They might be thinking it has to be very formal and it has to be very kind of, here's some written feedback, but you're saying that even at the younger levels, it could be very informal. Just have a more experienced coach with a less experienced coach, and then they can learn off them as they go up.
Yeah, just come along and run a training. You know, in other words, I did this fairly recently in New Zealand, where I watched the training of one of the club coaches. Kind of just sat on a hill while they did the training, and then we just had a chat afterwards. And I would have set up this drill a little differently, and that kind of thing. So it doesn't have to be super formal. There should be formal elements to it, but I think the best stuff really comes from that kind of feedback. It's just it's a practice of coaching, and so going out, having a run at it, getting it wrong, thinking about how to get it right, studying how to get it right, and getting good feedback. Getting better, having culture of getting better every day. That's really, I think, the main thing. And so for lower level coaches who are like, I've got a day job, and then I've got all this, I've got weekends or matches, and I've got the trainings in the evenings. When am I finding time for all this? It's a matter of finding people that fall in love with the sport enough that they're willing to kind of do the extra.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I do find that people are almost scared to ask, but generally if you ask a coach to go and mentor someone, 99 times out of 100, they'll say yes, and they'll be delighted to be asked.
Absolutely.
They'll do that, because coaches tend to like doing that sort of stuff.
100%.
They want to get them doing that, so that's excellent.
Yeah.
Dave, taking up way too much of your time. In terms of trying to summarize that, I'm not even going to start because it was far too good. There's far too much to summarize. We'll be here all day. Is there anything you'd like to sign off on in terms of just messages that we can take home? Well,
yeah. Listen, like I said, didn't bring any answers to this really, but I'm excited to learn a new sport. I want to come coach camogie.
Deal.
And come attend some trainings and see some matches. It's good stuff. And I'm just really encouraged that a sport that seems to be very similar to the sport I coach is asking all the same hard questions and trying to improve their program. So complete support what you guys are doing, and feel free to offer up my email, Stuart, or whatever, if people want to follow up at all. That was a dog squealing.
Is that perfect timing? It's saying
thing over a bone over there. Feel free to offer my contact information. I'm glad to follow up.
Yeah, because I'm going to say we'll put a slide at the end with it kind of written, but it's if you just want to say it out for people, if you're happy for people to contact you.
Yeah, definitely. So it's WLAX Coach Dave, WLAX Coach Dave at Gmail. Will get me.
Happy for any questions. Again, Dave, on behalf of myself and the Camogie Association, thanks again for taking up the time. Look forward to seeing you very soon in the sunshine of America.
Hope so, brother. All right, do well.
As I know, it's good over by, and we'll catch you soon.
Thanks.
Folks, thanks to everyone else for listening. Any questions, please either just fire them into me, stuart.reid@camogie.ie. You've got Dave's email address there, and we'll put it up on the end for any questions. Thanks again for listening.